So I think what's going to happen is it's not going to be the miracle drug that everybody is thinking it is, but it's still going to be significant, and and exactly how big it gets before it kind of stabilizes, hard to say. But I think it's going to be a big market and very interesting.
Welcome to the Business of Healthcare podcast from the Center for Healthcare Leadership and Management. The center is based at the Naveen Jindal School of Management at the University of Texas at Dallas. The show, like the center, brings together business leaders and other forward thinkers to discuss how best to meet the challenges of a rapidly changing, increasingly complex healthcare industry. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Kaiser, Director of the Master's Program in Healthcare Leadership and Management for Professionals. We are honored to have Jim Pollock on the Business of Healthcare podcast. Jim is a serial entrepreneur, an MIT engineer who's been actively involved in agricultural technologies in recent years. There's more to him about that, but we'll let him share it later. We are very lucky to have him join us today from Colorado, and we have a very interesting topic to discuss. It's going to be pretty interesting. So, Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Bob. I'm very, very happy to be a part of this and join you.
Okay, I'm going to start off. I'm going to lead with the key words, the key letters, actually, 3 of them. CBD. Awareness in the marketplace. It seems everywhere I look here in Texas, all around town, somebody is doing something with CBD. And there's a lot of interest from a commercial perspective, but I think there's a medical business undertone here that we'd like to explore with you just a little bit more. So, Jim, tell me what's happening. Why all of a sudden is this in the news? What's going on?
Well, it really has just exponentially jumped in the amount of times you hear the number or those letters CBD just in the last year for sure. 2 years, go beyond 2 years back, and you just about haven't heard that term. Not many people, and it actually helps to kind of back up a little bit and kind of get and drill down to it. And because really what we're talking about is some of the interesting compounds that are found in marijuana and hemp. And there's also pretty much most people have a good idea what marijuana is. But a lot of people actually are a little bit confused or don't really know what hemp is and how it fits together. And so the interesting thing to look at is out of the millions and millions of plants that surround us, and all that. And if you look at the classification system for plants, if you dig down, you're going to find that there is a family called Cannabinae. And if you take it one step below, you'll see that there's a plant genus called cannabis. And there's a word we've all heard. And cannabis, underneath that is there's a broad range and almost every month growing number of varieties that fit into cannabis, but pretty much they all fit into 2 categories, and it's marijuana, and there are varieties called hemp, and they're both in that same genus. And what's different primarily between all these different varieties is the ratio and the relative amounts of 2 particular compounds. One is CBD, which is cannabidiol, and THC, which a lot of people have heard that term, and that's tetrahydrocannabinol. So THC and CBD, those are the 2 particular compounds that the ratios of them and relative amounts of those will determine whether a plant is a marijuana plant or a hemp plant. And to even get more specific, marijuana that people smoke to get a high, it's the THC that actually gives you that psychoactive high. And the CBD actually doesn't give you a high. It's more associated with inflammation control and pain control. And to give you an idea of these ratios with marijuana, and they've been getting more and more potent, or varieties have been being developed that are more and more potent over the last decade or two. So now when you go buy, say, recreational marijuana, it will tend to have somewhere between 10 and 30% THC, or that psychoactive component, and it'll have just traces or very small amounts of CBD in it. Hemp, on the other hand, flips it around, where there's 5 to 20% CBD and just a very small, maybe only, in fact, but legally it has to be less than 0.3% THC. And that's actually the difference, is just if it's got less than 0.3% THC in it, then it's considered hemp. If it's got over 0.3%, then it's considered marijuana, even though you'd really need to get up into that 5 or 10% to even start to get a high.
So, Jim, you said the word legal. A few years ago, if we were talking about marijuana, and it's still illegal on a federal basis, I see a lot of states are starting to adopt the use of marijuana for medicinal and also recreational use. What's happened here in terms of being able to talk about hemp? Is it an illegal substance as well, or has it changed its status?
Yeah, so for a large number of years, hemp and marijuana were both considered by the federal government to be Schedule One drugs, which means it's illegal to grow them, either one, hemp or marijuana. It's illegal to grow them. It's illegal to use them, smoke them, eat them. It's illegal to sell them. So, and they're both considered the same, even though there's significant difference chemically between the two, as I just mentioned. What happened is there's been two phases. Probably about, I'm going to say in the last 3 to 5 years, several states independently went and decriminalized hemp. And that includes, the most famous is Colorado, Oregon, Wisconsin, and Kentucky are four. I think there's about a dozen states that decriminalized it, which means people could start growing hemp and doing various things with it. And that includes some things you've heard about that's actually been done for hundreds of years, which is using the fibrous stalks they have to make clothing and rope, or taking the leaves and buds and extracting out this CBD oil out of it for various uses. And so a few states started doing hemp that way, but it was still on a federal level considered a Schedule One illegal drug. Then the big change happened just this past December when Mitch McConnell in the Senate, who's from Kentucky and his constituency in Kentucky, introduced a hemp act that was attached to the big 2019 Farm Bill. And when that passed in December, was signed off and went into law, it actually descheduled hemp. So it is no longer in the same category as marijuana. And just suddenly, at the end of December, it's actually legal now from a federal viewpoint to grow, work with, sell, consume hemp. And so that's been the big change. And so what's been happening is in those few states that was legal to do hemp, they've been doubling in acres, still relatively small amounts of it, but doubling in acres for the last 3 or 4 years. And then suddenly this year, all states are legal, and some of the biggies like Colorado and Kentucky and all have jumped. There's like 10 times the number of acres being grown this coming year.
So let me see. You said Kentucky. It's known for bourbon and also tobacco. So is there a correlation here of growing hemp and tobacco?
Absolutely. That's the real trick here. Because if you look at Kentucky specifically, but also if you look at the states right around Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, those are tobacco growing states. And it's a significant part of their economy. And a significant number of people who make livings off tobacco or have made livings in the past off tobacco. And of course, with the popularity of tobacco dropping so much in the last decade or 2 decades here, a lot of those farmers have ended up with huge, 1,000-acre fields that are fallow. They don't have anything to grow, or they're trying to do alternatives, get into other crops to grow. And what's interesting is hemp is a very, very high production value crop that is now suddenly legal to do. And what's really interesting is the process of cultivating hemp is pretty much the same as tobacco. And the key thing being that once you cut it or harvest it out of the field, you need to immediately get it indoors so that it can dry in the dark. And that's exactly what you do with tobacco. So in essence, if you've been doing tobacco, then you have all the buildings and structures and drying areas to handle hemp. Whereas if you don't, that's actually a problem. It makes it very difficult for you to grow hemp unless you actually build that infrastructure.
So the government now has basically said, we have this farm bill, and did you mention a hemp act? Is there something called the hemp act as well?
Yes, the hemp act is it's one section of the or an add-on to the farm bill. So it's attached to the farm bill.
Okay. I'm always curious, this sounds like it may be like drug related, not in the harsh sense, but the FDA, are they involved at all with anything related to this hemp, marketing and sales and things of that nature?
They are, and they will be more. And that's because the big change here in hemp, because of this legalization, there's not a huge change in how much hemp is being used for, clothing and rope and things like that. The big change is the legalization of the oil and the CBD. And what does that do? I mean, why is that popular to start off with? And basically, there's not been any federal research to prove what CBD does, but it's anecdotally, pretty massively anecdotally, been associated with controlling things like epilepsy and seizure disorders, pain and inflammation, PTSD and anxiety, Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis, opioid withdrawal. So there's quite a few things that it's been associated with being able to help, which means that people want to consume it. They want to smoke it. They want to have rubs and salves that can rub on themselves and on pain points in their body. They want to be able to put tinctures under their tongue and let it get absorbed in the system. They want to have drinks that have this infused. All these different ways of being able to get this in your body, which means that immediately that the FDA has an interest because they want to make sure that you're not doing harmful things to yourself with things you ingest. So what happened was when this farm bill came out, it caught the FDA a little bit flat-footed. And about a week or two after the farm bill came out in December, the FDA came out with a letter that said, hey, everybody, hang on, the FDA, we're a little bit behind, but we're here. And so we will be studying this. We will be having some regulations to try to control this and make sure things are done safely and that people are labeling things properly and all and not making any false claims. But until we catch up, just be good, please. And that's literally kind of what happened. And so people are still jumping forward, trying to get products to the market. And at some point, the FDA will start trying to regulate.
This episode is brought to you by the Center for Healthcare Leadership and Management, the definitive resource for healthcare management education in North Texas. The center is based in the Naveen Jindal School of Management at the University of Texas at Dallas. It plays a unique role in training the next generation of healthcare leaders to meet local, regional, and national demands. The Jindal School uses its strengths in accounting, administration, finance, marketing, and information systems to educate highly qualified personnel for healthcare administration and executive leadership positions. The center is home to 7 healthcare leadership and management programs, including undergraduate and graduate programs, as well as executive programs for physicians and working professionals. For more information, visit us online at jindal.utdallas.edu/healthcare.
We talk about getting products to the market. You mentioned a variety of different ways this thing might be, put into the marketplace. How big is that? Just who is looking at where does this go? You mentioned some salves and beverages and things like that. And is this monumental, the growth aspect?
Yeah, I mean it's pretty amazing the amount of money that's being invested in it, the amount of number of products, small companies, large companies that have been jumping on this in the space. A lot of hype, but an actual lot of sales going on. And it's jumped from almost non-existent to being in the order of, I've seen numbers around $500 million or so in this coming year. And all the expectations I see are saying and projecting this turning into a $20 to $22 billion market just in the U.S. By about 2022, 2023. So the next 4 or 5 years, you're going to see this potentially be a $20+ billion market.
Well, you mentioned that universities are starting to look at and do research, and I think that's probably going to be a very important consideration. And it might be one of the largest factors contributing to growth. So do you know of any universities currently that are actually starting to do research? And you said they're allowed to now because it's no longer a federal violation. Is that right?
Yeah. So since it was a federal drug and basically illegal, then there was no federal funds allowed to go into doing any kind of investigation and research on both marijuana and hemp and CBD specifically then. And once it became legal and declassified or descheduled under the federal law, now it's possible for that to happen, and it's starting to happen. And where there have been just a few informal studies, small studies, and mostly about just things about like how much water does it take to grow it, just pretty innocuous things. Been a few universities kind of getting started, but now there's actually some major programs getting going. So Oregon State just a couple of weeks ago announced that they're investing several $1 million in a research center dedicated specifically to hemp and CBD and the effects of it. I think it's the University of New Hampshire, who's done a little bit of work in the past, now is getting some more formal programs in place. And I think you'll start seeing it at a lot of your typical agricultural schools like Colorado State here in Colorado pretty soon having programs in place, which means we'll start seeing actually having agronomists really studying how do you grow this stuff and optimize the growth and getting published information out there. And you'll start seeing actual studies that show what are the effects this has, both positive and negative, if there are any, on people. Because everything so far has been very anecdotal about what it's supposed to do.
So, Jim, on my commute home, I counted no less than a dozen retail outlets with flags in the yard, et cetera. Get CBD, get CBD. A number of these little retail shops are showing up. If you go into one and you buy CBD, is the quality consistent or is it all over the map? And what are the factors that go into making a quality CBD product?
Yeah, so right now it's still pretty wild west because they're in the early stages. And as we just talked about, the FDA hasn't put their foot down yet to really get into it. And they're trying to figure out what to do. So like one study I saw, because there actually are quite a few very good high quality labs that will do potency tests. So if you send your plant material or you send a product that's got CBD or THC in it, you can send it to these labs, and they actually are some very good labs that'll tell you what the potency is and the amount, of that material or that compound that's in the product. So one study I saw was a group that took 20 products that had CBD in it and had claims of how many milligrams, per ounce, or whatever. And they took all of those, sent them to a lab, tested them all, and out of the 20, 12 of them came back with significantly less numbers of amounts of CBD than was claimed, and the other 8 were slightly less. So none of them actually had the actual amount, and certainly none of them exceeded the amount. So there's a lot of inconsistency, and right now that's where there's no rules. And pretty much the only thing the FDA does, if they see a label that says this cures multiple sclerosis, this cures this, they will come down hard on them on that because they don't want any of those kind of claims to be on the labeling. So they'll get them. But as far as the percentages, the amount that's in there, they're just not there yet. So a lot of confusion out there about that.
Well, I think there's certainly a quality factor then as far as the marketing goes. If you're going to buy something that's okay or really good, there's a big differentiation there. So, Jim, I understand that, you've been a technologist throughout your careers and been involved with a lot of different technologies, and that there's also this gentleman farmer side of you too. So you've been involved in growing CBD in the last couple of years. What have you seen in the marketplace, and what's your takeaway from that?
Yeah, so I've always been an engineer, a geek, and a suburban brat. And then 4 years ago, my wife came to me and said, "Hey, there's this farm that just went for sale up north of Boulder. Let's go buy the farm and move there." And of course, my reaction was, "Why?" But we did, and been having a blast with it. And so on the side, kind of getting a little bit of farming. We did some hay and alfalfa for the first 3 years we were here, and then been hearing a lot of the same hype and a lot of the stuff about hemp, and thought. So I started looking into it, talked to quite a few different people. And there's an awful lot of disinformation. It's actually very difficult to actually really figure out what is the truth and what's going on because there's just not a lot of good, solid sources out there. So this is your classic. You got to go out and read 20 different websites and figure out that maybe 2 of those actually had some good information in them. So a lot of research necessary. But we ended up putting out about 5 acres of hemp as a little experiment last year, built a little infrastructure, got enough stuff in place and buildings in place to dry it. And did our first shot with it. And so through that, I've ended up learning, one, that there's not a broken supply chain for hemp. There's no supply chain. So it's kind of a totally wild west as to how do you grow this stuff? Then once you grow it, who do you actually sell it to? And how it gets processed, and where do you fit into the whole supply chain? So all of it's just kind of an interesting, kind of fascinating experiment to learn, and definitely was on the heavy learning curve, this whole past year. And we're right now doing our second season. We just planted 7 acres this year for a second season.
So I can anticipate seeing potentially big players get involved, tobacco companies, people that do the refinement to get the CBD oil and things of that nature, all pending if this is going to be something of great value. So as a closing summary here, where do you think this industry is going to go? Is it real? Is there real value there? Give me your personal opinion on that, if you would.
So there's no question there's a tremendous amount of hype, and there's a lot of people jumping on board. And what's really interesting is up until December, it was all pretty much a cottage industry. It was small farmers like myself doing 5 acres, 10 acres, maybe 20 for a pretty big one. And then usually it was somebody who's put together $100,000 and put together a system for extracting the oil, using some solvents to extract the oil out to make the CBD oil from the plant. And then they would then sell that to somebody who makes some tinctures or some lotions or whatever, and they sell it at a little retail store of their own. So it's all been very mom and pop shop, kind of sales and stuff. And because basically the bigger companies all were lusting after it and wanted to be a part of this, but they basically, when it wasn't legal at a national level, they can't afford. So your Walmarts and CVS's and Walgreens, they can't afford to get involved with that until it's actually legal at a federal level. So when the hemp bill got passed, Farm Bill with the Hemp Act got passed in December, then all of a sudden everybody jumped in. And so all your major retails and drug chains out there are jumping in a huge way. And all your beverage companies, all the beer companies, Coca-Cola, they've all made kind of quiet acquisitions of other beverage companies that they can make new drinks that have infused CBD in it and all. So there's definitely a lot of people jumping in. It's definitely going to become a big kind of thing. But where does it go? And I think what's going to happen, again, this is kind of just a personal opinion looking at this, is there's enough anecdotal evidence that there are some good things out there. I mean, it does look like it does help in a lot of chronic inflammation and pain situations that are very difficult, to cure or to handle and manage and all. And there's one, pretty incredible story that really started all this hype up. And the most famous one there's a syndrome called Dravet's syndrome, and it's a very rare, debilitating form of child epilepsy. And there's a little girl named Charlotte who had this problem. And basically they took a chance there, and they took a variety that they named after her called Charlotte's Web of hemp, derived the CBD oil, and over a 2-year period, she went from 1,200 seizures per month down to 3. And so that's sort of the story that got out there that really got things started up in this whole area. So it seems like there is some truth and there is some things to be derived from it, but I think like a lot of times, then it takes on some kind of almost a cartoonish epic kind of size. So I think what's going to happen is it's not going to be the miracle drug that everybody is thinking it is, but it's still going to be significant, and it will be, and exactly how big it gets before it kind of stabilizes, hard to say. But I think it's going to be a big market and very interesting.
Wow, that's very, very interesting situation. As we see everywhere in healthcare, the business of healthcare is changing. I think this is just a really great example of showing a new dimension of what things might be coming forth. So, Jim, we thank you for being on this podcast. We'd like to follow back up with you again later and see how this progresses. This has been very informative and very useful to our audience.
There's a lot of people interested in what happens with this, so happy to keep in touch, and let's talk about it again.
Okay, great deal. Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Business of Healthcare podcast. Join us online at businessofhealthcarepodcast.com to find episode links, notes, and more. Be sure to subscribe to the Business of Healthcare podcast on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcasting app. To learn more about the Center for Healthcare Leadership and Management, go to jundal.utdallas.edu and then search under the Center and Institutes tab on the navigation menu. Also, we want to hear from you. If you'd like to provide feedback, make suggestions for future guests or show topics, or just want to get in touch with us, email us at healthcarebizpodcast@utdallas.edu. Biz is spelled B-I-Z. And let us know how we're doing. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Kaiser, with the Center for Healthcare Leadership and Management, where we're leading change by changing how we lead.